Good morning. I'm Ed DeLaney from House District 86 in Indianapolis. I'm hoping to be reelected, although my friend Mark here is running against me. Uh, the election's next Tuesday. I've been in the House 14 years. I'm a lawyer, although I've retired from active practice as a lawyer. I serve on two committees in the legislature. I think they're the two most important. One is Ways and Means, and the other one is Education. And I focus most of my attention on those issues, although I'm interested in a lot of other issues. One of the benefits of being on Ways and Means is under our system, any bill that has more than $50,000 to it comes to the Ways and Means Committee, even if it's an insurance bill or a roads bill, whatever, we see it. So I've been concentrating on that a lot. I've not been enjoying this year as much because of all the national hostility that seems to seep into our state. And I'm here to talk with Mark because I think we're both trying to boost democracy. So we're going to make our effort. And I hope you got questions. Go ahead and ask them. I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thanks, Ed. We're here. I'm the Republican candidate for 86. It's a spam thing. I'm a Republican candidate for 86th district, legislative district. Yes, this is very concerning. The temper in our country today. The two-party system, as it was set up, wasn't set up. None of the framers at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 liked political parties. They called them factions. But nonetheless, they immediately formed two political parties. And it was a natural part of the physics, I think, because you had checks, you had balances, you had two forces that would oppose each other. That's had its good points over the 2+ centuries, almost three. It's also had its bad points. Right now, we see one party that's kind of careening off. And my first political exposure was as a 9-year-old, and I was politically aware of things, was trying to read as I could in the 1964 election race. I donated 25 cents to Barry Goldwater and Robert Miller in their campaign. I worked going door to door for the Democratic Party then, in 1970, when I started working more actively than as a little kid. I was still a kid. I'm a lawyer here in Indianapolis, graduated from DePauw for undergrad, and that was where I was politically active, but in a different way. It was on campus. I was student body president, and I saw people that I was raised in a farming area outside of Kokomo, and I hadn't been around people from Chicago. I'd never lived in a city before, and I thought Greencastle was a city. So when I ran for Congress 2 years ago in the Republican Party, my point was that we can't simply abandon one of the two parties to forces as they appeared at the time, and it kind of coalesced even more. And I had people say, well, you're not really serious about running as a Republican, are you? You're a progressive. The Republican Party was progressive for most of its history. And if you look at the problems we face today, a lot of them need progressive solutions. And so that's why I'm running. And I hoped that we could have, I was a debater in high school and college, and in campaign debates, I've never seen a real debate. And I thought if we could have a conversation today about the issues we've got, it would probably be a lot more conducive. Maybe we'll both learn some things, but also maybe the folks listening out there can learn some things too. So I yield the floor to you, Representative DeLaney.
Well,
The first issue
so the audience could know this. We kind of exchanged some ideas of topics, and the one that naturally was at the top of the list was the question of abortion. I attended, obviously, the session this summer, which was probably the most difficult 4 days I've had in the legislature. The hostility, the anger, the indifference to the public's views. I mean, we ended up passing a bill that apparently no witness testified in favor of, okay? A small group thought it was not radical enough in depriving women of their alternatives. The majority thought that it was way too radical. But that really, the bill appealed to no one. And it wasn't even really a compromise. There was a facade by allowing some limited exceptions, and I do mean they're limited in duration. They're also limited in the number of people they affect for rape and incest and so forth. those were a distraction from the real issue, which is whether the legislature or families make up their decision about who's going to have a child. And we came down on the wrong side. It's in the courts. It will never go away as an issue, in my view. The U.S. Supreme Court has dumped it back on the states. And so one of the reasons I'm glad to be in the legislature, and one of the reasons I'm running, is we're having to address issues that we didn't used to address. We, for example, may find out in the next few weeks or months that affirmative action will no longer be allowed in colleges and universities. We're going to have to decide how we deal with racial disparities on the educational side. So it's a good moment to be in the legislature. But anyway, that's my basic view on abortion. And I'm sort of saddened that we didn't have an open debate and come to some kind of a rational position. It's hard to come to a middle position on that, but it's hard to justify the extreme position we did take. I'll try to keep my talk limits about a minute or two when I talk, so that Mark has his turn. So it's Mark's turn.
And we're if either of us becomes too obtrusive over that, we can always say foul. I wasn't aware of this as an issue until my freshman year of college, and my freshman year I began at DePauw in the fall of '73, so it was post Roe. Any kind of difficulties that women had were it was beyond me. I had, let me put it this way, I had no such experience before college. And at this point, I'll say nobody has any business to try and interfere in a woman's decision in terms of what she's going to do with her body. Roe versus Wade, that opinion was written by Justice Blackmun, who had been counsel for the Mayo Clinic. And when he wrote that opinion, he was being very careful with it. He wanted to do as good of a narrative or history of abortion in the United States and in the world as he possibly could. And I talked to people who've on the right who say, well, it was the court legislating. But the decision has withstood all these decades, and it recognizes basic rights that are being attacked now. I met Justice Goldberg, by then he was no longer in the court. He had written in Griswold versus Connecticut, that was the privacy case, found a right to privacy. And but he wrote a concurring opinion where he said you don't have to go to a penumbra of emanations from rights in the Bill of Rights. You can go to the Ninth Amendment. It says those rights not specific or powers specifically delegated to the government are retained by the people. And I think that when we look at a fundamental right, like a right to privacy, that's not listed in the Bill of Rights, that underlines why it is that we have the Constitution construed, but also Hamilton said all of our rights. He didn't want to see a Bill of Rights adopted at any point, because he said when you list what rights you have, someone else can say everything else is something you don't have as a right. When it comes to this, it's women have a right to make that decision about their bodies. And I think that it's horrific what happened with the Dobbs decision overturning Roe. But also I'll add one more thing, and that is in Indiana, if we look at an exception for rape, for example, in Indiana, a biological father has rights. And there's no exception I've seen in our statutes for this. But if a woman is raped and forced to go to term with that pregnancy, our healthcare system is abysmal, and she has a higher mortality rate if she goes to term than than advanced countries. But if she survives that and gives birth, that father, the rapist, if he finds out that he was a father, has a right to visitation, has a right that the mother has to keep him aware of any addresses that she has, any phone numbers, and where she works. She also has to apprise him and get court permission if she's going to move more than 100 miles away. She has to provide him with visitation. Standard visitation is every other weekend, one evening during the week, and I think it's 2 or 3 weeks during the summer. And if she screws up, and let's say she's driving home from work, has a drink, and she gets pulled over and she flunks an OVWI, that man could petition the court for change of custody.
Now, Mark,
And then she could pay him support.
on this, I think our better lawyers would fight that back if it happened. I think that's a threat. The broader threat is for the over 98, 99% of the women who simply want the option to make a decision on their own. One of the reasons that some of us supported the idea of saying, all right, we were happy with Roe versus Wade, but we're realistic, we'll take 15 weeks with no particular exceptions. No, you don't need to tell anybody why. You've decided that you need to terminate this pregnancy because of your family's overall situation. You could do it. And so we tried to avoid making a narrow list of exceptions and then putting a tough deadline. That effort failed, obviously, because the list is very narrow and the deadline is very harsh. And for most people, there's essentially a total deadline. If you're not in one of those narrow categories, you're just not allowed to have an abortion. So it's a pretty damning situation. And I think you're right about your opinion about Roe versus Wade. Over time, the people became comfortable with it. When I looked at the demonstrators at the State House, and there were many, they were heavily female and heavily young. These were people who were raised to think that one of the things that they had some control over in their life was this issue. And suddenly we decided that no, you don't. And it's very disruptive. And it will not increase their belief in democracy, unfortunately. It'll make them feel like they're an object of democracy rather than a participant. And that's a broad topic and a difficulty. If I could change the subject, one of the things, Mark, you wanted to talk about was education.
Sure.
We're in a difficult moment where, in my view, the support for public education is eroding in our state legislature, as well as in other places in this country. And I'm talking about traditional public education and all the pressures to give money to charter schools or voucher schools, or to, in fact, do what they're doing in Arizona, which is just give the money to the parents and let them go basically buy services for their kids, which is remarkable. So I think it's a big problem. And to tie back into the political question, the press is beginning to catch on as to the change in our school board elections, which has been growing for some years. We have these out-of-state funded, typically, groups that are dubious about public education that send large sums of money into our school board races. $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 in a school board race is like $1 million in a congressional race. They're doing that without any limitations, and now recently it's become a political thing, and that some office holders and candidates are openly meeting with and supporting school board candidates, and basically saying they're fellow Republicans is what it comes down to. I'm opposed to that. I will vote in the school board race, obviously, but I'm not going to endorse somebody because my campaign is financed by all kinds of people who don't necessarily care about public education and who should not use me as a vehicle to help choose the school board. So this is, to me, it's very, very troubling, and we're going to have to address it. We'll see what the election results are on the school board next Tuesday, and they could be informative. They could be informative in a very bad way. I hope that won't happen.
Well, I think I was educated in a public school, and I went to high school near Kokomo, and I look at the schools today and compare them to what, and this is one thing, we'll talk about guns in a while, but I said this the other day when somebody asked me about education, what's the biggest barrier in public education right now? And I said, guns. I mean, I can't imagine being under that kind of stress all the time, but when you talk about the money, where it's going, and the pressure on from political sources. One, it's Citizens United is having its long-reaching effect. But two, and I don't mean to, and if I insult somebody, I'm sure I will. I don't see how people who never got beyond high school can legitimately start trying to dictate what the curriculum should be in a high school because they have no background and no understanding. And so many times that's used as a vehicle for specific religious views. And also it's used as a means by which the big issue in science was evolution and whether creationism could be taught as a science. And the United States Supreme Court, I think it was the Rehnquist court, said, no, that's not science, that's religion. I don't think that same opinion would be handed down today. And I think that's wrong when we start putting narrow views into education. We take away academic freedom of teachers who are there. And then also with vouchers coming into play, that's gutted a lot of the funding for public schools. And yet, and I saw somebody today wrote, it's an irony that people who complain about public schools and how they want vouchers, and you have all these standardized tests, well, they don't give the standardized tests where they're giving the vouchers. And I think that they're coming in at public education from different directions and trying to destroy it. And I think that, you're right. I think it's over politicized right now.
Yeah, it is.
And
It's a surprising negative change, and much of the influence comes from people who fundamentally doubt the value of public education, and who don't understand the First Amendment. I don't agree with you about people who only graduate from high school. My father only graduated from sixth grade. I don't know if he graduated. I don't know if he graduated at that level, but and he voted in the school boards and voted in favor of public education. I've always been a supporter of it, although my family has been very committed to Catholic education. I think the distinction that we're seeing is there's a lot of institutional hatred. So a lot of the people who want to change the schools because they think there's critical race theory and so forth are also very much against the unions. They're against the teachers. They don't understand the role of the teachers, and how critical they are and how they need our support. So I think that's a fundamental problem, is that they don't understand the teachers. Hello, kitty cat. And
it's Kate.
And they don't support them. They want to undercut them. The teachers are what's between us and the students. They're the ones who help the students. We need to help them. We need to see the value of the teachers and stop using the unions as a target to attack. I mean, the teachers union has people that actually live in Indiana and have decided to give some of their money to their organization to affect the schools where they work. That's about as democratic as you can get. But instead, we have all these out-of-state not-for-profits throwing in tens of thousands of dollars to people who just want to tear down the system. I mean, what's ironic is the most bitter races for school board are happening in Hamilton County, where everyone agrees the schools are superior. So what's the game? The game is anger and assault. They want to assault our institutions and express their anger. And unfortunately, they're having too much success, and they're being funded in part by people who support charters for some reasons that I don't share. And they'll throw money into these races in the school boards, which are not running the charter schools. So we've got a big problem with people wanting to stick their finger in somebody's eye and hurting our society, hurting our schools. So I'm particularly concerned about this year. It's just really gotten to a new level. We barely stopped this attempt to tell everybody what they should teach and to censor them that was tried in the legislature this past year. Fortunately, we stopped it. I hope we can stop it again. It depends in part on the results of this election.
Well,
Tell me, what topic do you want to go to next?
Well, I want to stay on this.
Got about 20 more minutes. Come
well,
on.
let's go on for a little bit more on education, though, just
Okay.
real quick. I think that there's an anger there. There's a Bruce Springsteen song. I forget which song it was. Maybe The River or something, where is a dream a lie if it doesn't come true, or is it something worse? No, maybe it's Allentown, and it's Billy Joel. Anyways,
Yes.
the whole idea is somebody bought into the system, went to school, got the diploma, did everything that they were supposed to do, and what's left. And I'm from near Kokomo, so I saw people who legitimately had as their goal working in the factory once they got out of high school for their lives, and they didn't have to worry about things. They put in their 40 hours a week, and there's no problem. At the same time, we lost in Vietnam, which sounds like it's no connection. But all these things were becoming soured for people. You know, we had never lost a war in people's minds. That really wasn't a war, and really there was no way we could win it. But I think that that comes over into our culture and affects also people being angry at school boards. And it's like they see somebody that's belligerent toward the system. There's a part of The Day the Earth Stood Still where Michael Rennie's character, who's the visitor from another planet, who's mixing among the people, they're looking at a flying saucer on the Washington Mall, and this kid goes, "How does that work?" And he goes, "Well, it works." And the alien who's actually flown the spaceship is telling the kid how it works according to physics. And then he realizes it's kind of quiet around him, and he looks up, and this guy goes, "Go ahead, mister." He's buying it, which shows an anti-intellectual bent towards making fun of somebody who's explaining the reality of what goes on. And I think that there are those strands in American culture. They were dominant in populism in the 1800s, coming into the 1900s.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that's something that we have to deal with in terms of education.
Look, some of these problems are not new. The KKK was very powerful in Indiana. It shouldn't be surprising that there's some sort of a mood or atmosphere of resentment, resentment about change. And that is the core problem: is do we want to move forward or look backward? That's the distinction. That's what I try to do. And I think that's what you're saying when you call yourself a progressive. You want to look forward, say, I am where I am. I'd like to make it better. I don't believe that I can go back. And if I did go back, I'm not sure it would be better. So for many, many people in this country, being in the 50s would not be better, or the 60s would not be better. All this hatred of the government, the example I like to give is, when I was a young man, maybe 30 years old, I used to tell people that I'm on Medicare. And they'd say, well, you're crazy. You're not anywhere near 65. How are you on Medicare? And my answer was, I've got two elderly parents. They're on Medicare. And because they're on Medicare, I put my money into my kids, into buying a home, instead of running from pillar to post trying to get enough money together to get my parents minimal care. So, I believe that there is progress. I believe that the government can do things. But a lot of people just reject that notion, and they express their anger about whatever they're disappointed with in life. Now, some of it is those of us on the other side have got to think, why are people upset? I mean, I find that one of the most interesting arguments is that, and we're going to switch the topic here, is this debate about whether you should arrest everyone who smokes a marijuana joint, okay, or not. And the arguments are very interesting. On my side of the aisle, my prosecutor says, look, that's not an important offense. I've got other priorities. I've got to deal with murder, rape, burglary, all these other problems. We don't need to tie up people and putting them in jail and wasting all that money over smoking a joint, something which is now legal in a majority of the states. So why would we do that? The other side simply says, we passed a law saying that's a crime. You should arrest everyone you see who's committing that crime and prosecute them, and if necessary, put them in jail. Cost is no object. Priority is no object. Rule compliance is the only object. And so they devote themselves to looking for somebody who's not enforcing all the rules all the time. And they get very angry. I don't know fully how to address that. I'm sort of in the middle. Marijuana is not legal. I would vote to make it legal if the feds would figure it out. And I think the ultimate solution, of course, to get down to the merits is for the Congress to wake up and say, marijuana is not the same as methamphetamine. Okay, so let's just treat it differently and let the states worry about it. But we're not there. We don't seem to get the Congress to act. We fool around with it here in the state, and I think we just need to be direct with people and say, let's move that limitation off into Washington, and then let's figure out how to do it. And by the way, it's not simple. I've looked at what goes on in Colorado and California, and there are consequences from legalizing marijuana other than just the lovely tax revenue. There's been all sorts of criminal law problems, all sorts of zoning problems, all kinds of issues. Okay.
And I'm
We
glad we
need to
can
look at
segue
those.
over to that.
We need to look at those, but we need to go ahead and do it smart. And that's sort of where I'm at.
I was in Massachusetts on a case. I represented women who were in a petition for writ of mandamus before the United States Supreme Court, were challenging the validity of the 2016 presidential election. And on the basis of violation of Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, that we had been invaded by a foreign power. There'd been a cyber invasion, which I still believe we
I
were
hope
right.
you lost.
I was at a party and somebody said, "Here, you want to hit?" And I said, I can't smoke that. I'm a lawyer in Indiana. And they said, "Well, it's legal here." And I said, "You don't understand. It's not legal under federal law, and it's not legal in Indiana. I'm governed by Indiana's laws." And they looked at me like I had, stick up my ass or something. I said, "But I do represent the First Church of Cannabis." And said, "Oh, dude." So, but here's my thing about the war on drugs, such as it is. It didn't work. The same arguments go for prohibition of alcohol as go for prohibition of marijuana, as go for prohibition of any drug. And there are going to be problems with the use of any substance. People are going to have problems with it. Portugal legalized all drugs 20 years ago. Any demographics for negative behavior that we normally associate with drugs or controlled substances, they're at the lowest in Portugal because people are dealing with that as just part of the environment. I think that we need to, I saw, of course, I'm questioning the validity of polls lately, but one last evening I saw said something like 91% of the American people, which I find that very high, and no pun intended, favor legalization of marijuana in some form. And I think that with that high of a percentage, Indiana is going to be like, again, the last to the party on legalizing things, but there are other costs. It's true, but the cost benefit analysis shows there aren't nearly the problems with marijuana as keeping it illegal. And when you have people going out, they can't get jobs because they've got a criminal history.
Yeah, I think that's a critical thing. And by the way, there's been some progress on that. The ability to get expungement is grown. It's very interesting. The Republicans have been cooperative on that issue, partly because the employers are saying, "I can't hire anybody because everybody flunks this test." So, okay. So the same way in the jail situation, the sheriffs do not want people who have mental or addiction problems in the jails. It's just a practical problem. They're not.
That's the majority of the people there.
Yeah, they're just saying. Yeah, they're just saying the cost is too great. We don't have staff, and so we are working in the legislature to try to deal with that and get people out of the system. And that's absolutely critical. People don't realize the costs of treating somebody. Well, actually, not treating somebody in jail. We're spending a lot of money to keep them there and not treat them and not improve the circumstance. So I think we're progressing on that. It's not because of people are losing their opposition to hard drugs, but what's going on is that people are realizing that the system is being strained by this opposition and that individuals are not being helped. That's the bottom line. We have to help the individual. So I think we're progressing on that one. It's kind of an exception. I think it's probably a financial thing because people don't want to build new jails. They don't want to pay all the money for that. And I think we're going to continue to progress on that one. That's one where I look at change in our legislature has been positive. It's really an exception. Generally, we haven't gone anywhere. If I wanted to get to one topic we haven't talked about, because I think you alluded to this, Mark, is the testing problem in schools. We have utterly failed at it. Okay, we've had two grand experiments. One was called iStep, one was called iLearn. They've just sort of disappeared. Nobody believed in them. They've gone. We spent millions and millions of dollars doing that. We're going to have to figure out an adult approach to assessing children and helping them. And it's very hard. It costs a lot of money to figure out where a kid is at, and more money to try to put them back on a better course. And I don't know if we're prepared to do that. And right now, what we do is we decide that we can go live where the schools are good if we've got money, and we don't have to worry about it. But if you don't have money or don't have mobility, or you're in a minority group in a neighborhood that you cannot afford to move out of, we're just allowing you to fail. And we just got to change that. That's very, very hard. And I think that's a core problem in politics. We want simple, instantaneous solutions to all problems, not hard work over the long haul. And that's part of the reason we have anger. The anger says something's wrong, I want it fixed today. We don't have commitment to solving these very real problems. It's very strange to see.
There's a person that I was speaking to when I was in law school, another lawyer, and he lived in Carmel, and I was talking about the per pupil expenditures for students inner city were much lower than, and he lived in Carmel, so that's a higher end. And he said money doesn't have anything to do with the quality of education a child gets. And I said, okay, then how about we do this? We'll flip the tax base that Carmel draws, and we'll give that money to Washington, and Washington will give you their tax base. He said, no, that's our money. I said, but if it doesn't mean anything. Now, the irony was his children went to private schools later. But the point, he was glad to say money doesn't really make a difference. It does. I mean, it's absurd to say it doesn't. And you look at the facilities that are available for children, if there are resources there, and also the resources mean that there are fewer children per teacher.
Yeah.
And so if you have a lower ratio of students per teacher, that's a lot more time that teacher can spend with them.
Right. They automatically get more attention. The core problem is the reliance on property taxes, which is very stressful. For example, on the west side of Indianapolis near the airport, Wayne Township, they have to keep passing referenda because their tax base is so low that people have to volunteer to pay extra taxes just to meet a minimum standard. The Wayne Township School District and the Carmel School District are almost identical in population, about 16,000 students. It's roughly, they get roughly, a homeowner pays roughly almost twice as much based on their value if they're in Wayne Township than they do if they're in Carmel. You have to overtax yourself because your properties are not as valuable. Okay, so we've got to reduce the reliance on property tax. I think that's a core issue. It's the only way to get fairness into the system. And we have to realize that some kids are more expensive to teach because they're further behind or have greater difficulties.
Well, and easy one viewer is saying great discussion, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. The two examples that people do understand and try to cooperate about are people who are learning English as a second language and disabled kids. We fund those with substantial funds, not enough to cover the cost. The cost of these two things are astronomical, but we at least pay a serious attention to it. The overall question of poverty and kids who are behind because of their home environment and poverty and so forth, we don't put anywhere near enough money to make up for that. We just don't do it. So what we're doing, we're starting to do to our public schools what we've done to the prosecutor's office for years, which is we take young lawyers, or in this case, young teachers, we put them in a city district, we train them, we sort out who's good and who's bad, and then we move the good ones out of the county. That's not an intentional program, but that's what's happening. So our school districts here are fighting to keep their good teachers because they can get easier work, smaller classes, and more money by going 10, 15 miles away. So that is a core problem that we're going to have to address. We have to be serious about it. And I think we need to look at the property tax part of our school funding.
What percentage is property tax? Is about 42, 43% of funding for schools?
I think it's a little less, but that's in the range. Yeah. And so that's an impossible hurdle to pass in a poorer area, a very hard hurdle to pass. And many of the homes in those areas are already at the property tax cap, so you can't get any more money out of the people there unless it's from a referendum, okay? And that's what's happening in IPS repeatedly. So yeah, I think it's 30 to 40% comes from the property taxes. But we have to adjust for the fact that some districts just don't have those resources. And the easy adjustment is by looking at the poverty aspect, okay? There's a strong correlation between low income and low housing values. We all know that. It's obvious. So we've got to say where there is low property tax value, we've got to buttress that. We've got to help those people by adjusting how much we give them. And you know, the other thing I hear a lot of, and you know, we're winding down here, but I think it's important, is mandates. One of the mandates we do now is we have a very complex system to graduate from high school. You can have different tracks and different requirements. We just don't have adequate counselors. So one of the reasons we have problems in this society is the kids who might have an opportunity aren't exposed to it. And their guidance counselor doesn't have time between setting up class schedules, dealing with social emotional problems, doesn't have time to deal with helping these kids find a path forward. And we need to take that away from the school districts. We need to fund that from the state. The schools should run it, but we need to start funding that. We can't be ordering that we want every kid to be prepared, every kid to take this course, every kid to get advanced credit, every kid to do all this stuff, and then not give them the support to get that done.
Well,
that's critical.
When we were doing when we had the town hall, Washington Township,
right,
week before last, you know, what I was saying was we need to have post-secondary education for non-academic areas. I mean,
right,
we need,
right.
but we need to put more of an emphasis on education across the board, and people
right.
shouldn't be going into debt because they're going to college. But this is tangential, and I didn't list this on the issues, but it brings to mind. I was on a seminar online about a year ago, and a guy was talking about, he was a community activist on the east side, and he said when law enforcement are coming in, they're being told that that's, I think they called it the jungle, and so their first deployment was going to be in the jungle, and there's this you're on an opponent situation where you're going to go in, and those people live here. You shouldn't be looking upon them as the enemy. And that's just an observation.
Well, they're your citizens. They're not strangers, and you're not an occupying force. We have to understand that. And you know, part of the debate about the police is that people who don't live in the city are always telling us how we need to run our criminal justice system. Well, I'm always grateful for advice, but I think their views are somewhat skewed. And I think we're trying, the mayor's trying, we're funding the police at the highest level ever. I was on the police merit board some years back, and I think we've got an honest, hardworking force. We don't have adequate number of officers, and we don't have the right relationship between the public and the police in a lot of our neighborhoods. And we're working on it, but that again is really hard, long-term work where we have to assure everybody that we love them. I mean, the head of the FOP, the police union, there isn't enough love on earth to make him happy. So he's always angry that he's not getting enough support. Well, the fact is he's getting a lot of support. And what we need to hear is a more positive attitude that what can we do to make the community comfortable with our police and vice versa. That is, again, not easy work. And getting angry about it and saying that we're defunding the police or something is just useless. Let's do the hard work.
And this kind of moves over into the area of guns, which would be the last topic. But when you're talking about defunding the police, a lot of the discussion in that has been unfairly labeled as defunding, because this iteration of the Republican Party, I'm always careful to call it that, likes to label and then castigate, and people don't have to think. It makes it much more simple. Police are called on to do triage work, essentially, for mental health situations. I don't know what the percentage is, but I'd say it's well over half. And so they're being sent with training increasingly for handling people with mental health problems. But it's like we need to take resources and put them into mental health so that we don't have that problem right there.
Yeah.
One of the major problems of which is somebody having a gun. And what I've said in the last couple of years is because of amendments, and this is specific to gun violence in Indiana. I don't own a gun, and that's, I think, the first step people can take against gun violence. Don't own one. And if you got to ask yourself, do I need a gun? I think you just answered the question. You shouldn't have one. My family had guns all over the place. My father had one next to the lazy boy in the living room. There was a long gun under the couch. There was a handgun on top of the refrigerator. He had a handgun in the nightstand. My brother had a long gun under his bed. I never understood the handgun on the refrigerator until I went to college, and I no longer had the bad stomach cramps that I'd had when I was a kid. I think that was one out that the guy had rather than eating the food there. But I was trying to look at statistics. So it was yeah. I could go into more detail, but
Mark, yeah, there is a problem, and I think we are not supporting the police when we got rid of the requirement that if you have a concealed weapon, you have to have a permit. That helped the police, and I must tell you, it helped a lot of citizens. People in minority groups explained to me that it was a pleasure to them that they had a license to have a concealed weapon. And so that if they were stopped by the police, they could show that if the conversation was going reasonably, they could say, hey, look, I do have a gun, but I have this permit. And the cops could look up and find out who had a permit and who didn't. This was reassuring to both sides of that conversation. But we've gotten rid of that reassurance because of some overblown idea as to what the Second Amendment means. I think guns are a concern. I think the fact is we have over 300 million guns. I sometimes think it's maybe 400 million guns I've heard. We can't get rid of them. What we need to do is change people's attitudes. We need to get rid of things like these bump stocks, which I think we're getting rid of those. We need to get rid of the devices that turn a simple pistol into an automatic weapon. These exist now. People can buy these. And we need to change our views as to how much self-defense I need. And as you point out, there's a danger in self-defense. Well, if I have a gun in the house, the chances of shooting myself intentionally or unintentionally have just gone up. That's just a fact.
But they've not shown.
This
is what they put a kibosh to with a couple of amendments in Congress. The NRA was able, and I look at people like Todd Young, who gets 5 times as much money from the NRA as he gets for a salary for being a United States Senator. And the NRA was able to stop studies by CDC, sponsored by CDC, of gun violence as a health risk. And so we don't have peer-reviewed studies that say whether, on balance, having a handgun in the home prevents crime as opposed to someone in the home being shot themselves or shooting a loved one. And because
I think the statistics are pretty clear. But if you count suicide as the use of a gun, which of course it is, it's very clear that the number of people who die by suicide or injury or one member of the family shooting the other is far higher than the number who can deal with home invasion. Okay.
Yeah, but that's the thing on the home invasions. What they'll say is a lot of the numbers don't come up because the home invasions don't make the statistical studies. And I can tell you that the studies that came out mid 90s and before showed that guns don't work in that way.
Well, it's a very difficult topic. I think the main thing that we need to do on the gun thing is to say let's try to make the resort to weapons go down, and let's talk about safety in a broader sense. Let's teach people who do want to use a gun how to use it safely. Let's mandate that, and let's get rid of the really crazy stuff so that the police aren't confronted by someone who basically has an automatic weapon. The police shouldn't have to face that. And the police are not happy with these loose provisions. They're not happy with getting rid of the requirement of a permit to have a concealed weapon. So I don't know who's helping the police. I don't think it's the people who push guns on us. I think it's the people who try to use some balance. So let's hope we get somewhere. I'm afraid, though, with the Supreme Court's position, that there's not much that can be done anymore. I
Well,
don't think
Chief
it's
Justice
hopeless, but there's a lot less that can be done.
Chief
as
Justice
long-
Warren Burger said, whoever it was that sold people on the notion that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to bear arms ran a good con job.
Yeah.
And
Well,
he was not a left-leaning justice by any means.
Well, we used to understand these things. We had some common understanding in this country. This current Supreme Court seems to take the position that that the only people who ever read the Constitution were themselves, and that it's a wooden instrument that just does not change, and that the only question is, what would I have thought in 1776? Well, Your Honor, you weren't alive in 1776. You wouldn't have thought a damn thing. So let's get off that. Well, anyway, it's time to go. It's been fun. And we fulfilled our promise to each other, which was we would have an honest discussion, even though we're opponents. And I hope to God we can somehow encourage other people to do that. There's been way too little mutual conversation or debate this year. So I want to thank you, Mark. You're the one who put this together and encouraged me to do it.
And thank you, Representative DeLaney, for being on here.
All right, you're in charge. You know how to turn it off.
Yeah, and I'm going to say, everybody, make sure you vote. If you don't vote, you can't complain. And
we agree on that.
If you don't believe in the system and you're registered, you can go in, ask for a ballot, and have nothing marked on it. That means that you're voting against the system because you didn't vote for anybody.
There he goes. All right, I'm off. Take care.
Take care.
All right, bye-bye.